Go. Okay, so we just listened to about 2.5 minutes of the first piece of our guest today, uh, Nomi Epstein. And should you introduce yourself? Do you want to introduce yourself, Dr. Epstein? You are muted. There
Yes,
you go.
you can call me Nomi.
Okay.
So I am Nomi Epstein. I'm a composer, Boston-based composer, curator, educator, and improviser, and I'm an experimental music practitioner. Yeah, I run an ensemble in Chicago where I used to live for about 20 years called Aperiodic. And I write music for ensembles and objects and people.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that seems to be quite the resume. Also, I want to mention that you are also associate professor at Berklee College of Music, right?
Yes.
Um, so you are kind of like a pretty rounded composer, I will say. So we are here today to speak about your music, mainly about the music that's found on your album Shades. Uh,
Yeah.
so let's begin talking about that. Megan, do you want to begin?
Yeah. I mean, I guess for a start, like, what? I mean, do you have an overall idea? Like, what was the overall idea for this album? Because you have, music that spans a little bit over a decade. Like, why these three pieces?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think my previous album, Sounds, which came out, I think in 2020 or 2019. Yeah. I had more of a concept of more of like instrumentation, a specific instrumentation, mainly around the piano for the album. And this one, I was featuring music for ensemble, and that was kind of what brought everything together. Um, I had toyed around with a number of options in terms of which pieces we would record. And the way it ended up was that I used a previous recording that I had made while I was doing a residency for a portrait concert in Berlin, where I made this piece Sounds that we just Sounds for Berlin that we just heard a snippet of. And the recording quality was great, but from that recording, but it was in a KM28, which is right on the street, and everything that goes by is heard incredibly loud. So we did a bunch of work so this is not a studio recording what we just heard, but a bunch of work was done to it to make it sound a little bit better. And then I had written a new piece for the ensemble that was to record this album, and I had wanted also to record another piece, which was the sextet, the last piece on the album that I had a great recording of, or I had a great concert, and you were there for sextet.
Yeah, for
that's
Schloss
right.
Solitude. Yeah,
That was our Schloss Solitude. Yeah, that's right. And but I wanted to get another take, of it with a different ensemble. So it's a little bit kind of thrown together in the sense that it wasn't conceived of as an album. Yeah, initially.
Okay.
okay.
So it's kind of like panoramic in a sense of your music, right? Because it has music from what I understand from 2011, from 2019, and from 2023. Would you say
Correct.
that it's very representative of you as a composer of where you are right now?
I would. Yeah, I would. And that's probably not the case for other pieces that I wrote back in 2011, but for sextet, I would say that's in line with the kind of sound world that I'm working in still. Yeah.
Okay. I will say that now that you mentioned that world, sound world, I will say that your sound world
Mhm.
seems to me like to be very kaleidoscopic. Seem to ponder upon the sounds, upon a certain aspect, and kind of like see it in
Mhm.
different lights, seen from different points of view. Is that how you think about music and sound? Is there a difference? Uh, what can you say about that?
Um, yeah. I mean, I think about, especially in maybe sextet, for example, the last piece on this program, which maybe fits more into what you were just describing,
Hmm.
um, of kind of my exploration of a very kind of carefully crafted and crafting object. And it's a fragile object that the listener can observe along with as it's being created, the listener can observe it. So I do think about it in terms of kind of like a physical, tactile kind of object. And of course, color, different kinds of color, timbre, and in that way, different kind of features or subtleties of this object. Yeah.
I will say that, yeah, there's this aspect of tangible, being tangible, of tangible objects, but there's also this aspect of pondering, of thinking about, of observing in stillness, of um, how would you say, being
I mean, I think
thoughtful,
the sound world is focused. It's not
focused.
all over the place. It's kind of focused, and then you get a lot of colors within that
Yeah,
focused.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, I work a lot with a reduced palette. And then, meaning
Yeah.
in terms of maybe surface activity or radical changes. All of the changes, and they may be many, are of kind of nuanced and subtle. And so while we enter the sound world of the piece, we become better listeners to it. And, had I set up, I mean, this is all of my music does this, but, in the midst of a different kind of music, maybe we wouldn't be able to enter into that kind of listening practice. So, yeah, it is a reflective, contemplative. I consider it to be very intimate, and the music itself, the way I allow for sounds to be created, I like to show the sounds kind of in their bareness. They're not kind of clothed by some sort of kind of put upon gesture. But they are the sounds that they are, and then they combine to create this object, this kind of fragile object.
I like how you describe like music as object, because how I perceive it then with your description, it will imply that the unfolding that there that let me put this right in words, like there's no real narrative or unfolding really. It's more about the pondering, more about the thoughtfulness, more about the stillness, more about contemplating, more about the reflection of the sound world itself.
Yeah,
What
I don't work with narrative in the traditional sense. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think a lot about sound as shape and color, and those are right there. Shape and color are non-temporal things, and of course, music is a temporal art. So, I still consider the experience of listening to it, and I think that the word you use, stillness, that stillness kind of allows for the opportunity of a change of one's conception of time and time passing, um, and within that, to kind of sense the duration of the piece as a moment. Yeah.
as a moment, huh?
So your overall duration, so in all three pieces, I think this next cut I think is a little longer, but they're all around like 20-ish minutes. Do you always work in that kind of time frame, or did you ever try to stretch the listeners?
Yeah, no, I haven't. Let's see. Oh, well, I guess I can say this. Sextet, the version that I've recorded and the version that we heard at Shaw Solitude by Surplus is an abridged version of this piece. And if ever this were to be performed in full, it would be somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour. So that's yet to happen. Yeah, I have the original version, and it's never been performed, and I don't know if it will. I mean, but yeah, yeah.
So what is the difference between what we heard and the original? Is it just longer at the end, or is different sections longer?
So the structure of the piece is such that I have these kind of pitch areas, and a particular kind of set of explorations, I'll say, happen to that pitch area, and then I'll move to another pitch area and explore that, and then another pitch area, and so on. And at the very end of the piece, the score itself is very short for this, but the very end is a very different process takes place. And the idea with that very different process is actually supposed to happen at the end of each of the pitch areas. So
Oh.
in this recording, it only happens at the last pitch area. Yeah. And I call those the suspension. I call those the suspension passages, where we really kind of suspend time and what could. I mean, it's like, I don't know. Let me see how long it is. I'm just looking at the score.
Is it it's just been abridged for like logistical reasons?
Yeah, it's been abridged for logistical reasons, exactly. And it can
because
be.
it reminds me, because some of the, I was going to say, because some of the way that like you challenge kind of listeners kind of reminds me of like the way that Morton Feldman liked to challenge his listeners, and he was kind of like playful with it. It was like, oh, how long can I push the listeners to do this? Which, yeah, I don't know. I think it was more experimental, his length, than anything. Like, he just wanted to see how long it could go. Yeah, but it'd be interesting to see, like, go even if it's like a 45-minute is the listening experience would be like much different than like a 20-minute piece. Does our brain process the material in different ways?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny though that last passage, the suspension passage, it's like 4 measures long, but it can take like 12 minutes to play. And when we did it in the recording session this time, I had it. The apartment house is like a fantastic ensemble, and it's just a joy to work with them. But they, they're used to playing a lot of experimental music. They've of course played Feldman. They've played literally everything experimental, and so their response to that was when the first time that we played this, it was very, very long suspension passage, because they really took what the instructions to heart. And then in the end, I had them move a little faster through it. And that's what we have on the recording. Mm-hmm. So even within the span of time of the recording that we have, it could have been much longer, The other thing about this piece is each of these kind of pitch areas, which I call super pitches, they each measure, there's a conductor, and the conducting role in this is to alter the tempi between quarters 30 and quarters 50 for each measure. So depending on the speed of their choice, the conductor's choice for tempi, for each measure, the piece will, be expanded or contracted. Yeah.
That's a very cool concept. So is the notation for all 3 pieces somewhat similar, or do they have their own characters notation-wise?
Yeah, they're definitely very differently. Well, I would say sextet is a very different notation from the other 2. And the other 2 pieces, the sextet is primarily notated with metered measures. I mean, each measure is the same length, or it's a 4/4 measure. But the other 2 pieces, so for sounds, for example, and there's a combination of types of notation, and some of it is text score, some of it is kind of text description of the process, and then there are moments that are not really metered, but there are moments that have more traditional notation, pitches, and techniques that are labeled very clearly with traditional notation. So that would be for sounds. And then for shades, this was my newest piece, and I've been working. I had just finished a trio. Well, just is meaning a number of years ago. But I had finished a trio where I had been working with an ensemble called Reading Music, or it was punked in the beginning, but and they're primarily, they do a lot of improvisation, Swedish ensemble, and the project, it was a commissioning project for just four composers, three composers, and they wanted us to incorporate, or while writing the piece, to honor their area specialty. So, and that's also what I do. I also improvise in this way. And so one of the things that I was working with, and that I work with in my ensemble and in other pieces, was a lot of the cueing and the kind of moving in and out of sections and in and out of material is based on these listening cues. And some of the listening cues require, some of the parts of these pieces require each performer to develop their own signals based on the material that I give them or the directives that I give them. And then in the midst of playing, each of the other performers has to always be listening for a particular type of sound that is acting as a cue. And they just won't know when that will occur throughout a piece. And once they do hear it, then they slowly kind of make their way into this new material or this new section of the piece. So I use that technique also in shades. And in shades, the I kind of consider it like the meat is these glissandi, and that was built.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the glissandi that was built using this technique that I wrote in my collections series. I started, I don't know when that was, but I wrote a commission piece for Eric Carlson, the violinist, called Collections for Eric. And I wanted to develop a piece that was a recording project piece that could only be completed by recording it and layering it and then doing all these kind of things to it once it was recorded. But I developed this notation where I create these collections of glissandi notated with just the interval, perfect fourth, and then I give a duration, like 20 seconds. And I don't say what note to start on. I do put the direction, so a glissandi up or a glissandi down, and I make like 50 or 60 collections, and 50 or 60 of these types of glissandi. And then in that piece, collections, he was to record each of these glissandi, and some of them stretch over 30 seconds, and some of them are just a few seconds long. And then to layer them and compile them in a particular way following other directions. So that was a recording project piece. So I used those sets of collections, that idea of sets of collections that each performer would choose from in performance, and like walk through and just perform at different times, choose a different one in the list of glissandi. So that's kind of like the meat of what the performers always return to. They start with that, and in between each of what I call moments, they'll return to that. But the way they move into a moment also has to do with listening cues and listening to one another. So in that way, there's some similarity between this punked or reading music piece that I was describing and this one.
Yeah, I mean, because so all of them really could be very different. Based on like every iteration could be very different. It'd be really interesting to see like a album where there was multiple like tracks of the same like piece of different, different even from different ensembles, or even from the same, ensemble interpreting it different ways.
Yeah, that would be nice. I agree. And my ensemble, we toy with that idea, especially when we recorded our second album, which was pieces written for the ensemble. And I wrote one of them as well, and two other members of the ensemble. And then We commissioned a piece from Michael Pizarro, and his piece also was similar to, well, not similar at all in the notation, but in the fact that it was completely malleable. I mean, he oftentimes will create these works that, like, you put together the score, you create the score based off of these things that he gives to you, and like that could go in so many different ways. And in rehearsal, I mean, it's like we played, I don't know, 15 different pieces, and we had to and we recorded all of them. We had to figure out which ones which one we would choose to put on the recording. So it is, with indeterminate pieces, it's really fun to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, each piece could really be a full album, like on its own.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Well, if they weren't the abridged versions, for sure, for sure. Uh, you've mentioned moments various times, and one cannot help being a composer of contemporary music to make the connection, at least conceptually, or at least in the semantics, to Stockhausen's moments form, in a way. But you might say that Stockhausen moment form are very heterogeneous. They use very heterogeneous materials for each moment. Would you say that there's a pitch there, an influence, an idea from moment form, in a way, to divide the sections? Or no,
I mean,
not.
I know that article very well, but I teach that article all the time, but I don't. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't influenced by that. I think when I established the kind of the way that I like to create music, I hadn't been exposed to that just yet, or
Mhm.
I didn't intake it really at that point. So I think it's partially, a lot of people who work with non-narrative music. I mean, if you think about how you can create non-narrative music, like you're not going to have bridges or transitions, like that would create a narrative in itself. So you can have one type. I mean, I don't I don't conceive of it that way, but thinking about it as an outsider, um, when you are to create a music of this sort, then perhaps you would stay within one type of sound world or texture, for a long period of time, or that is the whole piece, like a late Feldman piece, for example. Um, but my I mean, I'm not trying to create a music that has a particular trajectory like a narrative might, not like a teleological music. It's really, it's really about the now, right? Each moment, each now, along the way. And uh, I think that, yeah, I think that the non-narrative is, I mean, there's a lot of composers who explore that. But I also think that has to do for myself with like the the interest in exploration and reflection, as you mentioned, contemplation, and also the belief in very little material, seemingly very little material, can be absorbed and understood and re-understood, recontextualized, and appreciated, for its beauty, for its uniqueness, and we're not really able to get to that without kind of presenting it in this way. That's something.
Well, yeah. Along those lines, there's this idea of time. You've talked about time passing. That seems to be very important to you, and being composing music that is non-teleological, non-narrative. But that has also been described in the past as vertical music. Have you heard of the concept? I'm guessing that probably
No.
no. Is very much what you describe of music, of being in the now, being in the here and now. Uh, mm, Sometimes taking like when I first heard it was from Stockhausen also, or from that line of thought. It's kind of like music from India, Balinese music and stuff like that too. I'm not sure if you have taken influence from that type of music, or but I think that probably indirectly. I don't know. What are your influences? Can you speak about those?
Yeah, I mean,
You're creating?
I I'll preface it by saying I think this is the worst question. And it's no offense to you because I ask this of people all the time, right? This is what we ask other composers. What are your influences? It's like the number one question, right? Or like, who are your
Sure,
favorite
sure.
composers? Anything like that.
No
And I,
offense taken.
yeah,
Totally.
yeah, yeah. Because I mean, I'll say like on one hand, I am without a doubt, everything I've ever listened to is influential to me, regardless of my realizing it or not. And a lot of the realizations I enjoy the not knowing and the knowing of the process, my mind's process, and not being cognizant of perhaps an influence of something and then maybe realizing it later. Like that's a favorite thing of mine to do. I think I wrote a what did I write? Yeah, I wrote a violin and piano piece last year, actually for David Callhouse, who Megan knows. I think Megan knows, yeah. Um,
Mhm.
a duo, and I was just stuck. I was over the summer, and I was just stuck on this interval of the seventh, and this kind of like oscillating interval of the seventh, just up and down and up and down. And I couldn't stop writing it. And it's one of these returning kind of sounds that just happens over and over again throughout this piece. And then the fall came and I went back to school, Berkeley, and I take the train to get there. And the new T, we call it the T here, the MBTA, transportation, whatever. The new T's have subway cars have when their doors close, they have this major seventh ball. And I only realized then that that's what was causing me to be obsessed with this over the summer when I wasn't writing this. I don't write the T unless I'm going to work really. But so anyways, that was an influence for me, even though I wasn't really thinking about it in that way. I didn't realize it until after the fact. But on another note, I also think it's not, I don't think it's a forward process, the idea of influence, meaning like, I don't think you hear something and then you're influenced by it. Like my interest in things has made me listen to them more and understand them more and, try and learn about them more. And in that way, maybe my influence or my interest is influencing me to learn more about it. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
So yeah, so I mean, I'm influenced by, or things that kind of for me inspire me to write various things are the listening process, the focused listening process or practice. I sometimes get really interested in certain mechanisms that I see, like the way a machine might work, or the way a wind might knock something over repeatedly, or the way something might move. Those are really influential and inspirational to me. And then, like I'm now a deep listening practitioner in the Pauline Oliveros tradition. And, that practice, again, like that's been with me even before I knew what it was really. And then I kind of delved into it and became a practitioner. through study. And now, that's the practice itself is incredibly inspirational and influential to my work. And then, I mean, there's composers that I love to listen to, and there's might that be like a composer from the classical period or the romantic period or the baroque period, or not so much the new, but or a colleague of mine's music, and I think all of those things are influential. Yeah.
I can reformulate that also in the sense that, okay, you say, in, I ask about influences, but I could also reformulate it, ask it in another way. Like, do you use is your music conceived as conceptual? Does the concept come before the music? Like, do you have a concept in mind before the sounds, or do the sounds come before the concepts?
Yeah, I think it just depends on the piece. It really depends on the piece. Like for sextet, for example, I think I mentioned this in one of the interviews I did for sextet, but I was doing an artist residency in Florida with David Berman, who's an experimental music bigwig and wonderful human being. And I was collecting acorns in this space. We were at the Atlantic Center for the Arts in Florida. And I was collecting these acorns, and I was completely enamored with one of the acorns that I found. It was gorgeous. It was so smooth, and like the color, the shape of it, it was just, it's as if it was maybe like a piece of, what do they call it? Glass on the beach that's kind of, it has the kind of waves of color in it. And it had that in it. And I still have that acorn today. I've kept it. And I just stared at it and enjoyed it. And I went around to all of the other composers and I asked them to describe it to me. And I just wanted to hear kind of what they noticed first and what they spoke, how they described it first. And how the words that they used to describe it. And so, and I would record all of these with a little kind of mini recorder. And then I didn't know what I was going to do with that. And I didn't know if the voice recordings were going to become the piece that I was about to write, the sextet. And then somehow for me that translated into drawing these lines that were these short lines that were not, they were hand drawn, and I don't have a steady hand. So they were a little bit kind of crooked, or they would kind of go up and down a little bit. And I would just draw over one line and then draw on top of it over and over again. And it would just become this kind of like hazy, foggy line because I never drew it exactly the same way. And that is what sextet is. So each measure sextet is like one of those lines that I draw. And so each of the pitch areas is one of those like foggy sets of lines drawn over and over and over again on top of each other. And I just go through each of those once, and I have pages and pages of myself drawing these sets of lines. Yes. So in that way, there was a process, and I talk about translation a lot with my music, but there was this process that I guess in that way it was emotion, it was a concept, but it also had in my mind these lines like had to do with like never exactly the same, the presentation of something that was almost like the same but never exactly the same, right? And that's essentially what each measure of the sections of sextet are, or each breath, you could say, each breath of sextet. So yeah, it just depends on the piece. Sometimes I have a set of, like, for sounds, I think I worked more with a collection of sounds, a palette of sounds that I was interested in featuring, and then it's a matter of when they happen. And one does not lead to another, but it's just sometimes I will order them in various ways. And
So then that will be a translation of an object, pretty much, from a physical form into an oral or auditive form, right? Uh, would you say that you use that frequently, like trying to represent objects from the? Well, I think that probably you do, since you've described your music on physical terms, like representing the real world or the tangible world in a more abstract way through music. Would you say that you tend to do that
I don't think I would
sometimes?
describe it in those words, because I'm not trying to represent something. It's not, for me, it's not an attempt to represent something, because I think that's a representational method, and that is definitely not what I'm doing. But I'm, like, for example, I did write a piece where my dissertation piece, actually, where I every day I would walk to the beach in Chicago, or in Evanston, and I would sit and I would watch the waves. Now, there is a mechanism that happens when the waves build and then they crash and then they um, ebb and flow, and there is an ongoing process that's repeated, right? But it's always a little bit different, and there are different things that make it a wave crash harder, or more water come crashing down, and less water come crashing down. And, like, yeah, that is something that happens in nature, but that I'm not trying to represent that process. I'm just interested in that process in general, and somehow that, for me, ends up computing into a piece. So it is abstracted, but it's um, I don't know. I get interested in processes. I think. Yeah, yeah.
It would um, it wouldn't
Yeah.
go into the program note. You will would you say that that will go into the program note that you are writing for the piece, or kind of like loosely? No, not really. It's just like a type of, it's a material that you are taking basically from nature.
Yeah, and I don't always know that that's what it's going to be. I don't plan it out. Every day when I went to the beach, that's not what I had in mind. I wasn't trying to write a piece in that way. It's just that at some point I got really interested in that, and I just kept noticing. I mean, I enjoy sitting still and listening. I had a fantastic day today because I gave my music theory kids a quiz, and the room that we were in, the desks were so, like, really vaguely creaky, and it was the most amazing experience to hear them, like, erasing and shifting around. Anyways, it was this incredible experience listening to their taking the quiz. I just closed my eyes and listened to them. So, things, uh, subtle things can be of great interest to me. Yeah.
That's a good way to describe it. Subtle
Yeah.
thing. Because I was going to say that when I listen to your music, I kind of hear an attention to detail, but that's kind of a cliche way of saying it. I what I hear is that you listen to the small, to the specific, to the minute, that the details that you hear, that you are interested in, is not what most people are interested in and stop to listen to. And that kind of reflects in the overall music that you write, in the overall form, the forms of 25 minutes or 30 minutes, or I haven't heard a 50-minute piece version of your piece, but I would guess that that also translates into that. So you kind of like take, like, going back to the kaleidoscopic view of things, like you listen to things in a kaleidoscopic way and kind of transfer them, from my point of view. into these larger forms, bigger forms that translate into a listening experience. And now that I mentioned that, it's like it seems like the listening experience, and you also mentioned that you kind of get out of yourself, outside of yourself, to try and listen to the piece. Like you are not this type of tyrant composer in a way that try to impose uh, his or her will into the performers and the audience. Uh, how is that dialogue between composing, performers, and the listener, or at least you positioning yourself as the listener?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I understand what you're asking or what you're getting at, um, it's I don't believe it's my job to force anybody to listen to anything, let alone my music. And um, all I can offer is an invitation. I can't, nothing in my music is going to catch somebody's attention if they're focusing on something else. It's not. And so it is their choice. It's their work, to enter into it. And I invite that, but they don't have to. And I would never want to create a music that would do that. That's not my personality. That's not my musical personality or my compositional personality. Yeah. So with
I think the way you talk about I think the way you talk about your pieces being like experiencing, like coming from going to the beach and watching the waves, or the finding the pine cone, like it's it's bringing to light like very like mundane things in life. It's not like about anything like historical or big life events. And it's interesting because I kind of feel like that's like the attitude like towards the sounds itself, that it's not these like big drastic changes, but we're like we're given the opportunity to focus on these like smaller changes, and these smaller moments that we might not otherwise notice if there was other distractions in the music.
Yes, I'm sorry, was that a question? I didn't catch if that was a question.
No, not a question. I just thought I don't totally see how even if the process isn't like you are writing a piece about a pine cone. It like the experience of interacting with the pine cone kind of almost is similar to the experience of the listener interacting with the sounds, even though it's not directly about. That's at least how I kind of see it.
I think that's right. That's right. I mean, I think and that also plays into, or is influenced by, or is a product of, whatever, of why I am so drawn to deep listening, the deep listening practice. Like that's part of it, and we intake everything, and we don't have judgment. We try not to make a judgment and filter. We're trying to accept all sounds around us, and I am often drawn to the subtle, whatever the subtle might be. I'm not and that might be like anything visual. It could be something that I see, something that I experience. But yeah, I know you use the word. I think you used the word mundane, and while I would agree with that, I would also say like it's a spiritual experience to like really delve into these moments or these things, and it can be really beautiful.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I think it's like a gratitude
yeah
practice too. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't mean mundane as like a negative, but just it's in contrary to like people who, you know, write, I guess a lot of people who write more narratively about either their life events or historical events, um, you know, these flashy stories where these are just more, yeah, subtle.
Yeah. Yeah. I think subtle is a good term.
I think that how you describe your music and finding the spiritual in the mundane, in everyday like objects and stuff like that, uh, it's an idea that can be found in what is described as vertical music. I already mentioned this, but yeah, it is the here and now what is important. The what's in front of you, the stillness, the static, the living in the moment, not trying to get ahead of yourself, not trying to ponder upon the past, just being at peace with yourself. And I think that your music kind of expresses that in many ways,
Yeah. I mean,
in
I guess that's
certain
right. Yeah.
ways.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I would like to speak about sounds, like specifically the form of sounds, because how I listen to it is a bit more like, in contrast with Shades, the first track on the album. I think that Shades uh, is more static in a way. It's more periodic. Sounds, for example, it has these tapping rhythms that happen around 1:30. I can like, let me put the music here. We listen to a bit of it. Uh-huh. Okay. Got this long sound, super pitches, pitch areas. Would you call these pitch areas? No?
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't, but that's okay.
But then this would be interrupted by a surprise element around here, right? The tapping sounds, tapping rhythms. And that kind of for me it interrupts the, if there's a discourse. I know that you don't think of your music as discourse, as narration or anything like that, but when speaking about form, I think that it's more the more practical way of thinking. uh, Also here, for example, these long sounds, for me, the stillness, the verticality of the other things surrounding it kind of really makes an impact when the tapping rhythms come out. Can you talk about these rhythms a bit?
Yeah. Maybe we can stop the music. I hate speaking over
Yes,
music. Yeah.
sure.
Um, I try to do it in class all the time, and I just can't. um, but yeah, I mean, I see with sounds, the palette of sounds that I chose, which I think you're reacting to. There's a different kind of dynamic level with different sounds. And instead of all of the dynamics being around the same, some of the sound sources themselves just automatically create a louder sound. Like that's just a rock or a stone being drawn on the tuning pegs of the piano, right? So that sound is just going to be louder. Um, and we could have hushed that in the recording, but I didn't feel the need to. Um, and in terms of form, um, across a number of my pieces, the way that I construct form can be very mundane and boring, like the way I constructed form in sextet. It's just one pitch area, and then I do the same thing in another pitch area, and then I do the same thing in another pitch, right? It's and it's in some other works in terms of form, when I have this palette, because I do work with a lot of times with a palette of these very carefully constructed sounds, and it's just about ordering them and figuring out how long I will stay in that sound before a different sound comes in. And for that, I use an abstract kind of randomization to order them and to create the durations. And it's a randomization. I know a lot of people use like online randomizing websites, but I just use my brain and I create a form with I will, however many sounds I have, I'll assign without looking at them. I'll say, okay, if I have 6 sounds, one is going to be 2, another is going to be X, another is going to be a star, and another is, in a way that I won't be able to recognize or remember what each of them is. And I'll order those. And when I order them, they'll just return. And I'll do that kind of just randomly without thought of what one might sound next to each other, next to another, or how long I'm spending. And then I'll, decide on durations, 30 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, whatever it may be, one strike of something. And then I pull back the palette and I just fill it in.
I mention it because it not only surprised me, but I kind of sense or perceive it as structurally important. It also ends the piece. You close the piece with these rhythms, and it's kind of like a motive in a way. Although I don't think you would like that word very much, but yeah, uh, it's kind of like, yeah. I just wanted to listen what you
Yeah,
have
I
to
mean, I
say.
don't think you're the only one that hears that. And again, I think it's like the dynamic profile. It's hard not to recognize how different that is. The stone just rubbing along, bouncing along the metal tuning pegs. Um, yeah. So I don't think you're hearing that, unlike like most people. And that's fine to me. It's fine to hear it that way. I probably hear it differently, just because I know how it was composed, and it just as easily could have been another sound that ends it. Yeah. So it's interesting, and for sure that sound, that piece sounds is it sticks out more than the other 2 pieces on the album, for that, I think, that dynamic profile, and also like the amount of change between the different sounds of the palette, the sounds in the palette. They are quite different from one another.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, some of that, I mean, some of those sounds are like sounds that I do in my improvisation, because I play a lot of inside the piano. So a lot of those piano sounds are just kind of like my favorite sounds from improvising. And sometimes like I like to, the very beginning of that piece of sounds where you hear the violin and the voice. That's really it's a text section in which I just gave them instruction that one of them is the leader and the other is the follower, and they have to somehow change leader and follower at some point. And the idea is that one of them, they have to move very, very slowly through a glissandi, kind of changing shape very, very, very slowly, and the other one has to try and follow whatever the leader is doing, and be just like a microtone away from where they are. So they're constantly struggling and trying to maintain this. The followers constantly trying to maintain this relationship with the leader, and then at one point the relationship changes and the other one is the leader and follower, and so they're just like walking through that process.
I think that the difference that you mentioned in how we listen, how you, for example, will listen to it, and how I listen to it, has to deal with that you are more of a conceptual thinker of music, whereas I'm more of a formal thinker of music.
Yeah.
And I have to look for form, look for structure in music itself. Like, yeah, I I wouldn't really compose this type of music of stillness. It wouldn't go along with my personality, for example. But that's the beauty of composition and art in itself, I would say.
Yeah.
Uh,
No, and I think yeah, it's really like I said, like I can't I can't force anybody to listen the way that I listen. Just like you can't force anybody to listen the way that you listen. You know, we all come to it with our own personal practice, and that's like that's a wonderful thing. But I think, yeah, there's a lot of people who would listen to this or to another work of mine and try and make sense of it in a particular way, the way that their kind of listening analysis tools, that they use on any other work. And I work so much with music that just lives in a different world. And it's a different method of listening, and I love it. I really love it. And when I come to, I have to teach all this stuff too. I have to teach, theme and variations and sonata form and all of that. And so I can listen to pieces that way too, but I feel pretty strongly that just like we have performance practice, which is, it's a different performance practice for early music than it is for 19th century music. It's just a different way of playing, different set of instruments, different form of expression. Just like we have performance practice, we have listening practice. And so, we wouldn't, I always tell my students, like, you can't play Bach on a piano, but we understand music. As professionals, we study music so intensely, and we get to know, what the stylistically appropriate way to play it is, right? That's performance practice. But there is also I think stylistically appropriate ways to listen. Yeah. So it's not.
It's interesting. It's interesting that you do have, you do have so many recorded albums, but then your music is so, I guess it's indeterminate to a degree, or just, I guess, variable. But then the recordings just, record like one moment of the piece. So it almost seems like, with other composers, if I really wanted to understand their piece more, I would maybe listen to the piece many times. And I think it would help with your music if you were listening to live performers interpret the piece many times. But I don't know, like, what is your thoughts upon, like, the idea of, like, the albums just being like one snapshot of what your pieces can be?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. It's a great thing to ponder with any like indeterminate music, with like even improvised music, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do we decide which to capture and to make the thing that people are to hear and to focus on? And it's like a terrible decision to have to make, right? It's like, which of
Mm-hmm.
your children do you love the most, right? um, but yeah, I mean, and Cage didn't, with all of his indeterminate work, like he did not like recordings. He did not want anything to be clearly.
Yeah.
All of his music is recorded. But yeah, and I mean,
Yeah.
that's how he felt. He felt very strongly. I do not want anything recorded because there shouldn't be a fixed way of performance. I don't with my music. Like I'm very happy with the recordings that I have. I mean, I'm happy with the performances that I've had,
Mm-hmm.
and it's yeah. So I don't have that same perspective that Cage had, in
Mm-hmm.
that like I don't want there to be a fixed one. I'm fine because I'm happy with the product, I guess.
Yeah.
you
So
know?
what constitutes a good performance for you?
Yeah. I mean, in a lot of my text scores, that becomes a big question, because there's a lot more indeterminacy and there's a lot more put, I think, on performance practice,
Mm-hmm.
and with the idea that like if you take I don't know, any notated music, traditionally notated music, um, there's a level of skill required to just read the code, right? To understand the notation.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to text scores, um, anybody who's able to read the language that I'm writing in would be able to understand the code, the notation. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think, and even with like the Oliveros sonic notations, for example, right? Like anybody can play those or experience those, practice those. Um, so yeah, it's a struggle, and I talk about this a lot with my kind of a group of experimental composers who write a lot of indeterminate music, like I do, about the yeah, is it a performance practice issue? Like, is it something where, even if you're given this score, like, should it only a certain person with a certain experience be the ones to uh, execute or to bring this music to life? And I've had experiences with ensembles who do not do a good job. I mean, we've all had that, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
no different from anybody else. But in that way, sometimes it's because they haven't read the directions and they haven't kind of sat with the directions, because a lot of the text scores that I write are like pretty intricate text scores, and if you miss one direction, then like you've messed the whole thing up. But even in like less intricately texted works, yeah, I mean, there are definitely some versions and some groups that I would trust over others. And it's usually like people who I know play this kind of music, have experience with this kind of music. They usually do a really wonderful job. And then once in a while, I'll have a terrible performance. And if I my hope is that it's something that was not fully conceived of in the realization process. Like I feel my job is, even in these like text scores, is to put exactly as much information down as possible to elicit a number of different kinds of performances, but all of them should be, enjoyable and acceptable and the right kind of performance in my ears and my eyes, and that's tricky to do. But I hope to do that when I write these scores. So it doesn't uh, answer your question big time, but it or clearly, but it just gets at that. Like I think about it is. I think it's a performance practice thing, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
that like it should other kinds of musicians should not perform this kind of music. I don't think that at all. But I think it's a, you know, as you are invited to learn about any kind of music and way of performing music, I think it's the same thing. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
So yeah, it's interesting.
Well, Megan, do you have anything else for our guests here? We're over the
I
hour
think
mark.
yeah. No, I have a lot of yeah. I mean, she gave a lot of things to think about. I think with music.
Definitely.
Yeah,
So
Yeah.
you guys both had some really wonderful questions. So thank you for kind of,
Yeah.
well,
Thank
thank
you
you for
so much for
listening.
coming on.
Thank you for listening so carefully to my works and thinking about kind of the concepts and the um, the way that they were created and asking all these questions about their
Yeah.
creation and uh, their experience in the world and others experiencing them. So yes, thank you.
thank you for
Yeah.
coming in and
Yeah.
kind of having this conversation with us. It's been very informative, like listening to the composer and the pieces and how you conceive them, how you conceive of them, how you listen to them from the outside and from within, and how you exteriorize them. It was really cool. So,
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank
well,
you.
anything to add? Any of you?
I wish you luck with this podcast. Yeah, I don't know even know how long it's been going on, but
Not that like so we did it a little bit in the spring, and then we took a break, and I think this is the third episode back.
oh, really? That's
Right?
it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Well,
we had a bunch of episodes in the spring, and then we kind of yeah been kind of starting up again.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
fantastic. May I ask
Yeah.
what the title is about? Forgotten Composers. How did you come up with that?
Um.
We threw it
I
was yeah. It
I
was
think it was you and
between
yeah, I think it was you and
another
Shang that
member,
made it.
yeah, that graduated with
Yeah.
us, and we threw just a bunch of titles, and this is what stuck. They were the only one that
I
stuck.
mean, I
It
think
was just by chance,
a
let's
lot of
say.
what we talk about is, you know, there is music that gets a lot of attention with like, you know, big performances and grants, and it's such a small sliver of music, and then there is a lot of super interesting music that doesn't get quite the same platform, both you know, attention wise and monetary wise, that we were interested in, you know, talking more about.
I
Great.
think that Megan has defined it like conceptually more, and Shanting's
Yeah.
not here today. Like he's coming back in a week or so. I wish he was here, but he's coming. He's coming.
Uh,
He's coming back. The thing is that, yeah, I think that Megan pretty much hit hit it, like define it like conceptually what it's trying to do. Especially nowadays that I've seen how in the US it's kind of like it's like you guys have a great tradition on experimentalism, and I kind of seen
from
it
like the
from far away
70s.
that the image that you are trying to project on as we go
Yeah.
along in the 21st century is more of a conventional conservative one, unfortunately, at least to the world. I'm not there in the mainland in the US or anything. I know that a lot of stuff is going on still, but how the music of the US is projected outside of the US is more traditional, more conservative, more of the conservative side. So I guess that what Megan
Yeah, like near
is
romantic, minimal, like
yeah,
yeah,
pretty much
kind of.
orchestral music that is more teleological in the sense of the neo-romantic discourse, for example. That's what gets out there as US music. And I think that, yeah, you guys have such a great tradition on experimentalism from that comes from the 20th century and is still going on, and that needs to be visible somewhere, somehow.
Hmm.
So yeah,
Yeah.
that will be part of the mission if you want to call it that.
Yeah, well, I wish you all luck with it. I mean, it's a great project. So, and thank you
Yeah.
for asking me to join this time. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah. So great to have you.
Yeah.
Well, cool.
All right.
Uh, be safe and bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.